Today, I wanted to talk about introverted sensing and why introverted sensing is not introverted sensing, and why introverted sensing, as it's presented in um, Myers Briggs and other typologies, is really, really mistaken in one of its central assumptions. So, one of the prime assumptions that's made, or one of the prime um, predicates that's posited by people who think about introverted sensing is that it's related to bodily sensation. It's not. Introverted sensing is a set function. Introverted sensing is something that makes sense out of systems of objects and how those systems of objects all interrelate to create compound objects and compound states. So if each object and its boundaries is recognized and governed by extroverted sensing, or what I would say is an object boundary function, a physical object boundary function, then what we see happening is your physical object boundary function, or extroverted sensing, defines and makes discrete the objects in the environment. It tells you what is separate and what is its own thing. It tells you individual object boundaries. So it tells you, for instance, that the shirt I'm wearing is gray and black, and that there are boundaries between the gray and black. It tells you the general shape of my body. And SI tells you that when it takes the shape of my body and the shape of my head, the presence of hair and the fact that I'm speaking and all of these individual sensory experiences, it tells you that when those things are all combined, that you're looking at a person, right? So SE will tell you that you're hearing sound. It will tell you that I'm wearing a gray shirt and a black shirt, and that it zips up. It'll tell you that I'm sitting. But SI is what's going to tell you that I'm a person. Sitting was a bad example for SE. But in general, think of SE, or your object boundary function, as telling you all of the features and characteristics of an object. Because all the features and characteristics of an object are what make the object it, right? It's because, find a good object here. It's because this pen is long and narrow, and that it is clear or translucent, and that it has a ball point at the end of it. It's all of these features that combine to let me know that this is a ballpoint pen. I could take any of those features independently and they don't mean anything. SI is what tells you that this group of features presented to you together with this relationship means this. So it lets me see this as a pen rather than a streak of translucent narrow cylinder, or a blue cap, or just blue. It allows me to combine boundaries to make a superordinate structure and define that structure against other structures in my environment. So how does that look for people? So if we look at SI and the way it plays out, and if we take a lead SI user, for instance, and you go into their house, you see where they have all their things arranged. Oftentimes, if they're a healthy SI user, they'll have their things arranged in particular places. Everything will have a place, and they'll know where that place is. Now, why do they do that? Well, they arrange everything where they arrange it so that it maintains its status as a known object. When they interact with that room and all the objects within it, they're not interacting with each individual object all the time. There may be times when they do, when a single object is the focus of their action, but that's not their general state of relating. What they're doing is they're thinking of the compound object for memory efficiency. If everything is where it is, then they know how this compound object will relate to them, so long as they can believe that the environment has remained consistent. Now, if somebody comes and they move a coffee table in the living room of an SI user, a lead SI user, you're likely to see that that lead SI user, if they haven't noticed, they'll get up from the couch and they'll walk right into the coffee table. Well, if they're so aware of their body, why do they do that? And why is it that later, if you ask them what happened when you see the bruise, a lot of times they can't tell you. Can't tell you where it came from. It's not that they're so aware of their body. It's that they've taken certain environments or certain objects, and themselves included, as an interrelated whole. And they relate to the whole without looking at the individual pieces. So this looks like the way that lead NI users, because they can be any ignoring, right, can sometimes not want to focus on the details of a thing. They want to see the big picture. They don't care about the trees, every single tree. If you ask them to, oftentimes, they can delineate all the differences, and they can, through conscious effort, tell you the details. In the same way, if you ask the lead SI user where all the objects are, right, and what they are, and what their states are, they oftentimes can tell you, and they can pay attention to each of those objects. But that's not the place they want to operate from, because it's too memory inefficient for their primary way of relating. If they can make it a compound object, and then if they can have a set of action patterns that relate to the compound object rather than the individual objects within that environment, then this makes everything much more efficient. They don't need to look at everything. This also means, though, that if you move the individual objects in that environment or change their status in some way, and they don't recognize it right away, that now they can't relate to that object the same way. And if they attempt to relate to it in their previous manner of relating, then they're going to make mistakes because they haven't updated the compound object, the whole, to include the differences in the individual object relations within the environment. So they're not necessarily that aware of their body. Bodily awareness is an SE function, right? If you want to use Myers-Briggs terms. It's a object boundary function. So when I think of a bodily sensation, that's a physical thing, and it's one of the boundaries of me. And if I think of all of those bodily sensations together, all working, the breathing, the feeling, the smelling, the hearing, then that's SI me, right? And when I do that, I don't notice all of the things. I don't notice that I'm breathing all the time. I don't notice all of the smells around me, because I'm using SI in that moment to think of myself as a compound whole. And so long as not one of those individual object boundaries changes too much, that works. I can continue that way. This is why lead SI users also are sensitive to changes in temperature, changes in sound, volume, changes in brightness. Because if you change the individual objects in their environment too much, they have to pay attention to them. They have to update their status. If you make them hot, now they have to pay attention to their sensation of being hot. And they lose touch with their awareness of the whole. And them having to re-engage with the individual object boundaries of the self cause them to lose a certain amount of working memory that they would normally have devoted to maintaining the structures of the compound objects in their environment and how they're strung along together. This is how lead SI users can be so consistent and efficient. They can get so many things done. And they can do it over and over and over, day in and day out. It's actually easier for them if it's day in and day out. If you change it all the time, they're not nearly as efficient. because they found a way to take information about physical things in their environment and to reduce it, to compress it into its most efficient form, where they're only paying attention to the most necessary object boundaries within that environment at a given time. So lead SI users are kind of oblivious. They're not super sensors in the way that a lot of people like to paint them. They'll notice when something is out of the ordinary, but only if it's immediately apparent to them. It forces them to interact with it in a way that they don't expect the objects in their environment to relate to them. That was a clumsy way of saying it, but they'll only notice those changes when their old way of functioning doesn't work, or it's their relationship to that environment and their old action pattern doesn't produce the same result. So I hope that's helpful, because this is a huge problem. A lot of people think that this is the case, and it's not at all. It's very strange. And a lot of people think, like, if you take your SE polar types, right, like your INTP or your INFP, and they can be very sensory sensitive or averse. That's not because they're SI. It's because they're wildly weak SE. They have terrible object boundaries. And so they struggle to prioritize what object boundaries they should pay attention to in a given environment. So if their bodily state changes, their SE, their conscious use of SE is so weak that they can't prevent themselves from paying attention to the change. They can't pay attention, they can't keep themselves from paying attention to the scratchy feeling on the back of their neck from their tag on their shirt, or the taste of a certain food or a certain smell. It's not that they're great at sensing these things. It's that they're really bad at choosing what they're sensing. It's very different. So anyway, I hope this helps, and I hope it makes sense to you. And if you're not finding it easy to picture it this way, think of NI and NE, right? Which I would call your conceptual object boundary functions and your conceptual set function. We do this with NI and NE all the time. If you're really into type, you're probably a user of one of these functions, because you are taking the physical and you're trying to make a mental representation of it. I mean, other people, right? And if you're trying to put them into types so that you're not individually classifying the individual details for each individual in your life, then you're using NI, right? You're looking for certain object boundary relations, and then you're creating archetypes for particular object boundary relations and action patterns that represent individuals in a certain group, right? So we can say that INTPs or ESTJs or ENFJs, they all have particular object boundaries, action patterns, and way of relating to their environment that we can classify as being a compound object. And then we can make a mental representation of that compound object. And we can expect it to behave in certain ways in certain environments. And just like when you move the coffee table in the lead SI user's house and they run into it, if one of these types departs dramatically through conditioning or trauma, whatever it may be, I mean, that's still conditioning, then you'll run into their boundaries as an NI user too, right? Because they'll behave in a way that forces you to look at them as an individual object instead of as a compound object. You'll have to look at their individual boundaries and recognize that this individual departs from the pattern in some substantial way. And you'll run into them in the same way that the SI user will run into the coffee table. And when it doesn't make sense to you, you might not know that you ran into them in the same way, right? When you ask the SI user, where'd you get that bruise? And they don't know. Sometimes that happens with NI users too, where it's like, this representation isn't working, right? There's a change in the way that these objects interacted with each other. But I don't know what that change is. I can't tell you which objects it was or when that occurred. Same thing. So, anyway, it all comes down to working memory efficiency. How can we take the amount of working memory we have, and how can we manage the information coming in from our environment in the most efficient way possible? There's more to say about that, but let's just leave it there for now. I hope this is helpful.